In a tavern nestled within a snow-dusted town, whispers circulated about a madman on the war's battlefields. Patrons spoke of a mercenary who fought with a chilling disregard for his own life. He was said to appear wherever the empire was at war, fighting not for money, but as if seeking revenge. The most unsettling rumor claimed he was the prince of a fallen kingdom. In a desolate, snow-covered forest, the man in question, Yuri, sat wounded, seeming to seek a place to die. A figure in black armor approached, accusing him of self-torture. The knight knew his full, dishonorable name, Yuri Briol, the third prince who brought his kingdom to ruin. The name was a curse, a reminder of a past 10 years gone. Back then, at a casino, an 18-year-old Yuri was on a winning streak, laughing at his own luck. His companion, the court major Nando, looked on with impressed concern at his narrow, consistent victories. When his opponents tried to leave, Yuri goaded them. He theatrically flashed a peace sign, demanding they double the stakes. Hernando tried to hurry him along, reminding him they would be late. The mood soured when one of the men slammed the table. He accused Yuri of using dirty tricks. Outraged, Yuri stood up, questioning if the man knew who he was. The man mocked him, scoffing at the idea that he could be a noble, let alone the king. His companions chimed in, insulting the king and princes for antagonizing the empire, saying the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. That was the last straw. Yuri sent the table, cards, and chips flying with a furious swipe. The men stared in shock. He stepped on a shattered glass, addressing the three stooges before him. Cracking his knuckles, he introduced himself as Yuri Briol, the third prince of Briol. The men recoiled in fear. Yuri smiled, telling them they were about to be reborn by his hands. Their terrified screams filled the room, followed by the sickening sounds of a one-sided beating. Later that night, under a starry sky, Yuri finally met with Princess Yekaterina Ivarna Granzine. He insisted he was serious, explaining that an urgent meeting with his father had made him late, a message he had already sent via pigeon. The princess, unimpressed with his excuses, crossed her arms. She remarked that he wasn't the only busy person, as she had to sneak out to meet him. He pleaded for understanding, mentioning his father was leaving soon and that he had to be careful, a fact he wasn't supposed to tell other people. Yekaterina seized on his poor choice of words with a sly smile, asking if that's all she was to him. Yuri stammered, flustered and unable to explain himself. She turned from him, questioning why he would give her the jeweled necklace if he didn't trust her. She told him not to contact her again until she contacted him first and walked away. He could only watch her leave, calling her name into the empty street. Alone, he wondered how he would fix things this time. He felt a presence, realizing it would be hard to earn her forgiveness. A sinister smile crept across a shadowy face nearby. After that day, the fragile relationship between Briol and the Empire shattered completely. The Empire's provocations turned into open aggression, and the conflict grew. It was war. A soldier screamed the news. The Empire had invaded Briol. Cries to evacuate echoed through the burning castle. Yuri ran, shouting for the people to be told to leave. The war against the Empire had begun. He plunged into the flames of battle. An eternity seemed to pass, filled with countless sacrifices. The war felt endless. His men were falling, crying out for reinforcements that never came. With Fiori Briol, the continent's strongest man, absent, the war began to lean in the Empire's favor. Looking back, Yuri understood the ugly truth he had long tried to deny. Yekaterina had betrayed him. The invasion began just after he told her his father was leaving. He had wanted to believe it was a coincidence, but the single word written on the note a pigeon delivered from her had shattered that hope. Sorry. The message only brought him despair. The enemy soldiers recognized him as the prince, knowing his death would mean the end for Briol. The battle was unending. He fought relentlessly, his sword a blur of motion, his body a shield, parrying blow after blow. His teeth grit with exhaustion. He cut down another foe, but could only stand panting, leaning on his sword. He was surrounded again. More soldiers appeared, their faces grim. He felt a cold sweat, wondering if this was where he would die. An enemy's sword struck him. Before the final blow could land, another body shielded him. A blade pierced through his savior's chest. Yuri stared in horror. It was his friend, Laurent. With his last breath, Laurent urged his highness to escape. Yuri screamed his name. His knights deflected another attack, begging him to fall back. They insisted he had to live for Briol's future. He fled as the enemy shouted for his capture. He ran through the woods, the soldiers close behind. He found refuge behind some crates in a dark warehouse. He knew he couldn't hide there forever. He had to escape and figure out what to do. He agonized over his father's fate, concluding he had probably been killed. Suddenly, a knight stood in the doorway. No, Yuri thought. He couldn't die here. He had to live. He couldn't let the knight's sacrifices be in vain. He clenched his fists. He knelt before the knight and apologized. The knight spoke briefly, promising the Empire would pay for its sins before ordering Yuri to leave. He warned that the Empire's soldiers would soon arrive. Yuri ran through the forest, panting for breath. He vowed to live, to reconstruct Briol, and to get revenge. But that was just a child's naive hope. Reality was much harsher. Everyone died, and he was left with nothing but questions. He was simply punishing himself now. Clutching the necklace, he hoped that someday, someone would appear and finally kill him. Back in the present, the armored knight called his endless fighting and desire for rest nothing more than selfish self-torture. Yuri noted that the knight looked ready to kill him and told him to get on with it. He was shocked, however, that this stranger knew his name. Everyone who knew his past was supposed to be dead. The knight gripped his helmet, claiming it was all Yuri's fault. He removed his helm, revealing a scarred but familiar face. A tear traced a path down Yuri's cheek as he whispered the name in disbelief. It was Laurent, but he had died. Laurent's voice was filled with venom, blaming Yuri for the fall of the kingdom and his own family's honor. A dead man, a ghost from his past, had come back to accuse him of his sins. Laurent charged and drove his sword into Yuri's chest. Yuri had thought death would bring relief, but the damn guilt was crushing him even in his final moments. The necklace fell from his grasp. His father's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him that Briol's successors do not abandon honor. A distant voice called his name. Yuri Briol's eyes snapped open to find himself a boy again, lying in bed, someone shouting his name. A sharp cry of his name jolted Yuri Briol awake. He blinked, finding himself in his childhood bed. A voice noted that he'd been asleep for 3 days. A stern, familiar face leaned over him, asking if he was all right. It was his father, but that was impossible. His father was dead. A cold dread washed over him as he wondered if this was the afterlife. He concluded that if his father was here, they must both be in hell. He quipped that while he might deserve it, he was surprised to see his father there too. When he reached out, he felt the solid, warm reality of his father's hand. Continuing his morbid joke, he mused that for someone who preached so much about honor, his father had certainly lived a decadent life. The response was a sharp smack to the head, with his father demanding to know what nonsense he was spouting. Rubbing the new lump on his head, Yuri complained that his father couldn't fix his hitting habit, even in hell. A leaf drifted in through the open window, catching his eye. The scene outside was peaceful and alive. The maids were not here. He saw the familiar palace fountain and the castle staff going about their duties. This wasn't hell. There were no sinners, no hellfire, no demons to torment him. This was something else entirely. Just then, his 2 brothers peered into the room, wondering if he had woken up. His family rushed to his bedside, their faces etched with concern. They called his name. He was 13 years old again. At first, he thought it might be a long dream or an elaborate case of déjà vu. He tried to force himself to wake up, but the world remained solid. Nothing changed. Instead, long-forgotten memories began to replay exactly as they had before. He had to accept the unbelievable truth. He had returned to the spring of his 13th year, given a second chance. The next morning, he threw open the curtains, embracing the light. A maid, Aina, entered to wake him. He mumbled a sleepy reply. She announced it was time for his sword training. That snapped him fully awake. He scrambled out of bed in a panic, calling for his clothes before deciding he needed to wash up first. Aina, ever patient, urged him to calm down. She gently offered to help him wash his face. For a fleeting, horrifying moment, he saw an image of her, dead and bloodied, a ghost from the future he had left behind. He paused. Turning to Aina, he made an odd request. He told her to slap him hard across the face. A man's got to know if he's dreaming, right? She looked horrified, asking if he was ordering her to commit treason. He simply replied that it wasn't treason if he ordered it. He puffed out his chest, about to declare that he never went back on his word. Before he could finish, a wooden sword smacked him across the cheek. He found himself in the training yard, staggering from the blow. He'd forgotten how strong Aina was. Across the yard, his brothers snickered, but no one offered him any ointment. The hit hadn't come from Aina. It came from his sword instructor, Bernard. Yuri remembered this phase of his training. Bernard, frustrated with his laziness, had resorted to only sparring. He recalled how Bernard had once lamented to his father that the prince was wasting his God-given talent. Bernard believed that with a bit of diligence, Yuri could become Briol's greatest blessing. It was then that everything began to go wrong. Because he was uncooperative, his training became a joke. Hearing his instructor's disappointment only made him lazier. Not this time. Yuri called out to Bernard. He declared that starting today, he wanted to be taught properly. Yuri Briol would now give it his all. Bernard looked surprised, but a slow smile spread across his face. He understood. A powerful blue aura erupted around the instructor. From this moment forth, the real training would begin. Yuri had a brief moment of panic. Bernard moved with blinding speed. Yuri grimaced. He'd forgotten. This wasn't just any instructor. Bernard was wreathed in a fearsome energy. The man's eyes glowed. Before coming to Briol, Bernard was known by another name, the Sword Demon. The training was grueling. Afterwards, Yuri lay sprawled on the ground, panting. Without his future experience as a mercenary, he would have been utterly destroyed. As tiring as it was, he knew this was the fastest path to improvement. Bernard stood over him, stunned. The prince had blocked every single attack. He couldn't fathom how his highness had improved so drastically overnight. As he called out to the prince, Aina came running, out of breath. She announced that his majesty was asking for him. Bernard added that Count Johannes had arrived with his son. Yuri's blood ran cold. He knew that name. In his previous life, that was the man who betrayed the kingdom. Got Barkvar. The traitor was here. Yuri called Aina's name, his voice low. His eyes narrowed with a chilling intensity as he asked where that bastard was right now. A lavish meal was spread across the long dining table. The royal family, along with Count Johannes and his son, sat in a strained silence. Count Johannes remarked how much the third prince had changed. He added that Yuri's physique looked much better as well. The king wryly suggested that if his son had eaten something strange to cause such a change, perhaps the count should share it with his own son. Gott glared at his father, who deflected by praising the king's smart son. Yuri couldn't help but notice Gott's envious stare at his older brother, who seemed to be the perfect child. He returned the glare with interest, an unsettling intensity in his eyes. The younger Barkvar shifted uncomfortably, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. Yuri's older brother leaned in, whispering. He asked if something had happened between Yuri and Gott. Yuri whispered back that the bastard had stabbed him in the back. His brother smirked, asking if the great Yuri Briol was just going to let that slide. Yuri watched Gott, who was trying to appear dignified while nervously scanning the room. He hadn't changed a bit. He looked so nervous. Yuri could see the familiar tics and nervous glances. As if he thought. He decided he would have to fix that temper of his. This was for Gott's own good. The last life must not be allowed to repeat itself. He recalled fighting Gott around this same time in his past life. It was a petty squabble, but he wondered if that grudge could have been the seed of Gott's betrayal. He found Gott in the garden and commented that he heard he was decent with a sword. He told him the kingdom had no place for narrow-minded knights. Gott was confused, but Yuri pressed on, declaring that Gott was destined to become a knight and serve the kingdom. Got hesitantly agreed. This is a duel, Yuri shouted, launching himself forward. Got barely blocked the attack, crying foul at the ambush. Yuri sidestepped and jabbed Got in the face with the end of his practice sword. Got stumbled back, pleading with the prince to uphold the knight's code. Yuri tossed his practice sword aside. Got stared, aghast that he would throw away his weapon. Yuri closed the distance with a smile and sent Got sprawling with a kick. Got cried out in pain. Yuri picked up his practice sword. Towering over the fallen boy, he reminded him of his past betrayal, of selling out his own father for information. He asked Got why he thought his father held such a high title. What was it all for? He understood the hunger to survive, but not here, not in Bryall. Not a single knight would be allowed such weak conviction on his watch, and that included himself. He asked again, why was his father a count, and who gave him that power? He extended a hand, telling Got to reflect on his words, to understand the essence of his position. Got, chastened, accepted his hand. As Got walked away, defeated, Yuri's brother approached, impressed. He was surprised Yuri was so good at fighting. What, you thought I'd lose? Yuri deadpanned. His brother laughed, yeah. Yuri grumbled, asking what his brother even thought of him. His brother teased, calling him the kingdom's biggest troublemaker and gambler. Dude, I've seen you lose your allowance on a single roll of the dice. Yuri shook his head, insisting he wasn't going to live like that anymore and that his brother should stop messing around as well. His brother looked at him, bewildered. He smiled, asking if something had come loose in Yuri's brain. As the sun began to set, Yuri finished his training, collapsing to the ground in exhaustion. Bernard praised his excellent work, telling him they were done for the day. He called out to His Highness. Bernard told him it was time he started learning a mana method. Yuri asked if Bernard would teach him his, but the instructor refused, saying it wasn't suitable for someone of his caliber. He insisted Yuri should learn the Bryall method, a fine and efficient technique. Yuri already knew this. He had mastered it in his past life and reached its peak as a mercenary. Bernard noticed his hesitation and asked if he was considering something else. Yuri admitted he was thinking. An idea sparked. He asked Bernard to recommend someone from the Royal Guard, someone with exceptional potential, even if they weren't yet skilled. He remembered a technique he couldn't even attempt in his previous life. Bernard considered the request. If it was purely potential they were looking for, then Jared stood out the most. Yuri knew the name. Jared. He remembered meeting him near the end of the war. Jared's skills were mediocre, and it was a miracle he had survived so long. He had lamented his lack of training, frustrated by his own weakness. He had incredible natural talent, but had never sharpened his gifts. By the time the war came, they were both just rusty swords. All right then, Yuri said, a new resolve in his voice. He decided to go meet his potential knight. He saw Jared in the courtyard. It was time to knock some sense into him. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Yuri found the Royal Guard's training grounds, a knight named Rosso standing watch on a balcony. Rosso noticed Yuri approaching. He greeted the prince, asking what brought him there. Yuri, with a casual wave, said he was just checking in. Rosso laughed, saying that while everyone was working hard, they couldn't compare to Yuri. Yuri looked down at the knights sparring below, all of them moving with a fiery intensity. He asked where he could find the rookie, Jared. Rosso pointed him out. Watching Jared, Yuri finally understood what Bernard meant. While it was important to improve one's skills, Jared was only doing the bare minimum. This, Yuri realized, was how he became a rusty sword. He turned to Rosso and requested a wooden sword, announcing his intention to spar. When Rosso asked who his opponent would be, Yuri pointed down at the slacker. Moments later, Yuri and Jared faced each other on the training floor. The other knights heckled Jared from the balcony, telling the rookie to do his best and stay on his toes. Jared looked annoyed. Yuri told him he had heard about his great potential. He challenged Jared to show him what kind of knight he was. Jared nervously agreed. Now then, Yuri began, taking a step forward. He hoped Jared wouldn't disappoint him. Jared's eyes widened in focus. Their wooden swords clashed in a flurry of motion. The other knights were impressed, remarking on how sharp and precise Jared's movements were. They cheered for Yuri to hang in there. But Jared knew something was off. He parried another blow. Their swords locked. He realized the distance between them was always the same. It felt like a performance. Yuri was syncing his pace to match his. "Isn't this boring?" Yuri asked with a smirk. He tapped his sword against Jared's. "Shall we go at it for real now?" he asked, his eyes gleaming with a newfound fire. He moved with surprising speed, and Jared barely blocked the attack, grunting with effort. Yuri was impressed by his beast-like reflexes. He pressed the attack, a blur of motion. Jared was forced back, parrying wildly. "I was trying to take it easy," he grunted, frustrated. A feint left him open, and Yuri struck his leg. Yuri gritted his teeth. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Even with his past memories, Jared was still a seasoned knight. He hadn't expected to win, but he still wanted to land at least one solid hit. Jared saw an opening as Yuri used a powerful, unfamiliar technique. But Yuri wanted that one hit. With a spinning kick, he sent Jared's sword flying and landed a clean blow. "This is it." Yuri cheered, ecstatic. The other knights were stunned, amazed that his attack had actually worked. "You're not holding back, are you?" Yuri asked with a grin. "Not at all," he answered himself, his eyes glinting. This was strange. Jared felt like he was being cornered, even though he was the one pressing the attack. He took a step back. He unleashed a powerful swing. Yuri dodged, the attack just missing him. "So close," he cried. Jared was getting annoyed. His comrades yelled at him from the balcony, asking if he'd lost his mind. He was using a mana method, and against the third prince, no less. They shouted for him to snap out of it. The force of Jared's mana-infused strike sheared off a lock of Yuri's hair. "Ah," Yuri said, a newfound respect in his eyes. Jared rushed to his side, asking if he was all right. The other knights crowded around, calling Jared a lunatic. Yuri waved them off, saying it was just sparring. He was fine. He then tied the severed lock of hair around his head like a blindfold, telling Jared to pick up his sword. "It was just starting to get fun," he said with a grin. "No reason to stop now." He stepped forward, and their duel resumed with renewed intensity. Jared realized this prince was different. He was pushing himself to the limit, and even beyond. Their swords clashed again, sparks flying. He was driving himself even further. The sparring continued under the fading light. Jared felt his blood begin to boil. It was a feeling he'd never experienced, not even when fighting stronger opponents. Yuri parried another blow, his eyes focused and intense. This young prince, with every step he took and every swing of his sword, was awakening something primal within him. "Damn," Jared grunted, feeling the pressure. He gripped his sword tighter. With a burst of energy, he unleashed a powerful attack. The wooden swords shattered on impact, the pieces scattering across the floor. The force of the blow sent Jared stumbling back. Yuri let out a sigh of relief. "It's over," he announced with a tired smile. Jared stood panting, his mana still swirling around him. Yuri extended a hand, telling Jared he had learned something from him today. Jared took his hand, stammering that it was nothing and that the prince had done great work. He had never before witnessed such fighting spirit and obsession. How could such a young prince? "What you doing?" Yuri asked, snapping him out of his thoughts. He gestured to his own bleeding forehead. "You made the prince bleed. Are you just going to stand there?" The other knights chimed in, and Jared, flustered, stammered out an apology. He then scurried off to find a first aid kit, looking like a headless chicken. Yuri collapsed to the floor, exhausted but satisfied. The knights on the balcony cheered. "That was so cool, Your Highness," they shouted. Suddenly, a voice cut through the noise. It was the captain of the Royal Guard, Saint. He said he had just arrived. He had seen the whole thing, from Yuri's collapse to his shattered sword. He stroked his chin thoughtfully. A few days later, under a bright morning sun, Jared was walking through a courtyard. A voice asked if he was done with his shift. It was the third prince. Yuri hummed a little tune. He told Jared to come with him, that they had somewhere to go. Jared protested, saying he needed to train. Yuri reminded him that it was thanks to him that Jared had fixed his mentality, so he should repay the favor. Jared reluctantly agreed. Yuri was pleased. Jared had some strength now, and though it wasn't enough, It would have to be sufficient for now. Jared asked where they were headed. Yuri just told him to keep quiet and follow. When Jared voiced his concern about potential danger, Yuri reassured him with a sly grin, saying they were bringing one more person with them. And who would that be? Jared asked. Hey, Yuri shouted, cupping his hands around his mouth. Hernando, he called out. The court mage turned, surprised. Yuri told him he needed assistance with a trip. Hernando began to protest, saying he had other plans, but Yuri cut him off with a simple offer. He would pay off Hernando's gambling debt. The mage was stunned into silence. Yuri confirmed he was serious, adding that he could also pay off the debt Hernando owed him from last time. He asked Hernando if he had ever seen him lie. The mage conceded that he hadn't, but only because he'd never seen the prince outside of a gambling den. Yuri beamed. Right. He didn't seem to catch the jab. Was I that bad? He wondered aloud. He promised to pay off the debt and urged them to follow. Well, if that's the case, Hernando said, a devious smile on his face. He produced a contract out of thin air, demanding Yuri's signature. Yuri just stared at him, deadpan. He couldn't believe his title was only worth this much. He pointed at Jared, telling him to act as a witness. Jared, bewildered, agreed. With the deal struck, Hernando happily agreed to go with them. He then asked where they were going that required a knight and a mage. To the Sword Mountain, Yuri replied. A wicked smile spread across his face. From now on, he declared, we are heading to loot the ancestors' dungeon. The group made their way through a dark, vine-choked tunnel beneath the palace. Jared, leading with a torch, couldn't hide his surprise at this hidden path's existence. He asked the prince where the cave led, and Yuri calmly explained their destination was Sword Mountain. Jared recognized the name from the legends of their kingdom's progenitor. With a grim look, Yuri confirmed his suspicion. He knew this place from a dark future that only he remembered. In his previous life, after Bryal had fallen, the invading empire discovered a hidden dungeon within the mountain, unearthing the long-lost legacy of the Bryal progenitor. The discovery had caused a massive commotion. Yuri recalled that this path had been intended as an escape route, but its very purpose meant the legacy was lost to the enemy before it could ever be used to save them. This time, however, will be different. He would not be running away. He would advance and see for himself what his ancestor had left behind. They emerged from the darkness into a lush forest. Yuri pushed open the heavy stone door, leading his two companions into the sunlight. Hernando, ever the pragmatist, correctly guessed they were heading straight for Sword Mountain. He then noticed the artifact key Yuri had used and curiously asked where the prince had found it. Yuri brushed him off, stating it was none of his business, the memory of his past ignorance a bitter pill to swallow. As they walked, Hernando yelped, having been scratched by a thorny plant. Yuri warned him to be more careful, as the foliage here was sharp, and continued to lead the way through the dense woods. Hernando leaned over to Jared, whispering to ask if the prince had been eating something weird lately, to which the knight gave a subtle nod of agreement. Their chatter was cut short by Yuri's sharp command to hurry up, prompting Hernando to muse that at least the prince's short temper hadn't changed. Suddenly, Yuri's eyes widened, and he held up a hand, telling them to wait. He pointed towards a clearing where a pack of direwolves prowled. He explained that they moved in groups, meaning there were likely more nearby. When asked how he knew, Yuri simply said he had read it in a book. The statement struck Hernando with the force of a physical blow. The thought of Yuri, the delinquent prince, reading a book was as likely as a fish discovering fire. Yuri urged them to pass quietly while they remained unnoticed. Of course, it was at that exact moment that Hernando stepped on a dry twig. The loud crack shattered the silence. The mage offered a pathetic, apologetic laugh, just as a direwolf lunged at him. Jared shouted his name in alarm, but before the wolf could connect, the knight flashed forward in a streak of blue mana, bisecting the beast in midair. The wolf fell to the ground in a heap. Yuri complimented Jared on his quick thinking, recognizing the mana technique used to bypass the wolf's thick fur. The victory was short-lived, however, as he warned that they had now attracted the alpha's attention. A piercing howl from the woods confirmed his fear. The pack descended upon them. Jared, his sword glowing with power, ordered the other two to stay behind him as he met the snarling beasts head-on. He fought with fierce determination, his eyes alight with mana, cutting through the charging wolves. Hernando remarked on his skill, but Yuri knew it wasn't enough. Jared was being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The knight grunted, struggling to hold his ground. Yuri turned to his other companion. He reminded Hernando that the king trusted his abilities completely and that now was the time to prove that trust was well placed. A smirk spread across Hernando's face as he accepted the challenge, a swirling ball of fire appearing in his hand as he prepared to unleash his full power. While Jared was preoccupied, a massive fireball erupted from behind him, engulfing the remaining wolves and sending the knight stumbling forward from the blast. The explosion incinerated the pack. After the unforeseen delay, they finally reached their destination, the peak of Sword Mountain. The barren, rocky summit left Jared feeling skeptical. Yuri assured him they were in the right place, though even he felt a flicker of doubt. Then he saw it, the hilt of a sword barely visible among the rocks. He rushed over, telling them they had to pull out. Jared scrambled to help, though Hernando complained about getting his hands dirty. Ignoring him, they gripped the hilt together. With a great heave, they pulled the ancient blade from the earth. Yuri held the great sword aloft. It shone in the sunlight, looking pristine and new, much to Hernando's astonishment. As Yuri examined the blade, he saw a single word etched into the steel: guilty. Jared wondered aloud if this was the founder's relic. With a knowing smile, Yuri replied that they were about to find out. At that moment, the ground trembled violently and then gave way. The solid rock crumbled beneath their feet, plunging all three of them into the darkness that had just opened below. The ground disappeared beneath them in a shower of rock and dust, plunging the trio into a deep, subterranean cavern. Yuri came to with a jolt, his fall cushioned by Jared, who groaned beneath him, having instinctively wrapped them both in mana to survive the impact. Yuri was impressed by the knight's quick thinking. Meanwhile, Hernando floated down like a dandelion seed on the wind, surrounded by glowing orbs of light, and remarked on how deep the cave was. Yuri shot him a withering glare, accusing him of saving himself while abandoning his prince. Before Hernando could offer a flimsy excuse, Yuri had him by the collar. Desperate, the mage pointed frantically into the darkness, but the prince wasn't falling for the diversion. Hernando insisted it wasn't a trick, shrieking that he saw a ghost as a pair of red eyes ignited in the gloom. Yuri turned, his eyes widening in surprise. A hulking figure in black armor stepped out of the shadows, its presence radiating cold malice. Yuri identified the undead creature as a death knight. He harshly kicked Jared, who was still dazed on the ground, ordering him to get up. The knight scrambled to his feet, disoriented, his jaw dropping at the sight of the imposing foe. He immediately drew his sword and stood protectively in front of the prince, vowing to handle the monster. As the Death Knight took a heavy step forward, Yuri calmly recalled everything he knew about them. They were knights returned from the dead, more powerful than they had been in life. He stepped past Jared, waving off his concern and explaining that the creature wasn't dangerous. When the baffled knight asked how he could possibly know, Yuri simply replied that he could feel it. He reasoned that a guardian of the Founder's dungeon wouldn't harm a descendant of the Founder's bloodline. He then confidently asked the Death Knight if he was correct, but was met only with silence. Suddenly, the Death Knight raised its massive sword. Both Jared and Hernando screamed a warning, yelling for the prince to watch out as the blade swung down with terrifying speed. Hernando watched in horror, convinced the prince's head had been split in half. Yuri, however, was unharmed, save for a single lock of hair that now lay on the ground. He shot a death glare at Hernando, who quickly corrected himself, stammering that he meant the prince's head of hair had been split. A gravelly voice echoed from the knight's helmet, remarking that Yuri's condescending attitude was just like his. When Yuri asked who he was talking about, the knight answered with a name that stunned them all: Eric Bryall. Yuri explained to his companions that Eric Bryal was the legendary founder of their kingdom, the first king who had conquered the continent with a single sword. He then asked the knight if he was the first to have ever reached this place, and the knight confirmed it, explaining that no one without the founder's blood could have drawn the sword from the mountain. Yuri looked down at the weapon in his hands, realizing it was truly the treasure of his ancestor. The Death Knight then clarified that it was the sword he had used, revealing his true identity. He asked Yuri why he was making such a strange face, to which the prince awkwardly apologized for touching his belongings. The founder's spirit, Eric Bryal, stared down at his descendant and demanded to know his purpose for coming. Gripping the ancient sword, Yuri declared himself the rightful heir and demanded that Eric pass on his legacy. The red eyes of the Death Knight glowed intensely as he turned, stating the time had come to fulfill his duty. He agreed to grant what Yuri sought and began to lead the way deeper into the cavern. Yuri followed without hesitation. Jared, however, was still trying to process the absurdity of the situation. One moment he was a royal guard. The next he was talking to the ghost of the first king in a secret dungeon. This was definitely not in the job description. Yuri called out to him, snapping him out of his trance. The knight blinked, confused, shaking off a strange vision of the old, arrogant Yuri. Seeing the real prince waiting, he dismissed it as a hallucination and hurried to catch up. Eric led them to a chamber dominated by giant, glowing blue crystals. He knelt, and as he did, a blinding light engulfed the three companions. Eric's voice echoed around them, expressing his hope that they would all prove worthy. Yuri found himself standing alone in a vast, empty desert under an orange sky, wondering where he was. In the distance, a lone figure walked toward him. Yuri squinted, thinking it might be the founder, but as it drew closer, he realized something was wrong. The figure broke into a sprint, and Yuri saw that it wasn't human at all. He barely managed to parry its lightning-fast strike. The creature's body began to glow with a faint blue light, and in that moment, Yuri understood. This wasn't a creature. It was a pure manifestation of a mana method. Yuri's eyes widened in disbelief as he identified the glowing blue figure before him as a pure mana method. He watched, stunned, as the entity touched its chest, a core of energy flaring within it. The being radiated power, its sword shimmering with ethereal light. Yuri realized with a jolt that this was a live demonstration, a direct lesson on how to operate mana. The featureless figure beckoned to him, a clear invitation to copy its movements. Yuri was baffled by the sheer audacity of this training method. He let out a disbelieving laugh, thinking his legendary ancestor must have been completely out of his mind. To teach someone who hadn't even learned a basic mana method by throwing them in a live combat was insane. Yet, he knew this was an opportunity only someone like him could take, a person living a second life with nothing to lose and everything to gain. He knelt, placing a hand on the cracked earth, trying to coax his own mana into existence. A weak flicker of energy danced around his fingertips. The mana entity seemed to mock him for the feeble attempt. With a smirk, Yuri decided that since he was unsure of the proper technique, he would just have to improvise and get on with it. His resolve hardened. He had to become stronger. He knew that soon, the Empire would invade Briol. And this time he would not fail. He would destroy them and refuse to repeat the mistakes of his past. This was his chance to master the swordsmanship of Eric Briol. He channeled his mana into the ancient sword, his eyes blazing with determination, and met the entity's next attack head-on, vowing to absorb every bit of its power. The world shifted, and Jared found himself standing alone inside what looked like the palace training grounds. He blinked in confusion, recognizing his surroundings, but not how he got there. He looked around the empty hall, touching his head to confirm he wasn't dreaming. He drew his sword and called out, challenging whoever was hiding to show themselves. Heavy footsteps answered him, and from the shadows emerged a figure that made his eyes widen in shock. It was a perfect copy of himself, a doppelganger. He instantly knew this was the Death Knight's test. He asked the figure its name, wondering if it was also Jared. The copy simply smiled, its voice a cold echo of his own, telling him not to defy his fate. Jared was taken aback by its words. His double taunted him, reminding him that he only became a royal guard to live a comfortable life. It warned him to stay away from the third prince, telling him that fighting destiny would only lead to a miserable existence. Jared let out a sharp breath. He knew that the old him, the lazy knight from before, would have agreed without hesitation. But then an image of the new, determined Yuri flashed in his mind, and he remembered the prince calling that kind of life boring. A confident smirk spread across Jared's face. He told the fake that it was the one who didn't understand, explaining that a sword, once swung, could not be taken back, and dwelling on the past would only cloud his mind. There was no point in regret, only moving forward. The doppelganger called his thinking arrogant and lunged forward, its sword glowing with blue mana. Jared met the attack with his own power. He recognized the fighting style instantly. It was defensive, simple, and unwilling to take any risks. It was the swordsmanship of his past self. He leaped back, a grim smile on his face. This was utterly boring. With a powerful shout, he shattered his double's guard and drove his blade through its chest. He caught his breath as his defeated opponent fell, but the fight wasn't over. The doppelganger's form dissolved into a grotesque, bubbling sludge, its shape shifting and growing. Before his eyes, it reformed into a hulking, monstrous creature. Jared stared up at its new, terrifying form. He knew Yuri was fighting his own battle somewhere else, and a surge of resolve filled him. He took his stance, praying that his prince would overcome his trial, just as he would overcome his own. He would win this fight for both of them. Back in the desolate landscape, the world seemed to warp around Yuri. He was slumped against a rock wall, exhausted and beaten. The trial had taken its toll, leaving him barely able to stand. But the mana entity was not finished. It raised its hand, gathering a final, massive burst of energy that erupted toward the helpless prince. The mana entity gathered its power for a final, overwhelming strike, unleashing it upon the exhausted prince. Pushed to his limit, Yuri gripped the ancient sword with newfound resolve, channeling every ounce of his newly learned power into a desperate counterattack. The two forces of pure mana collided in a blinding, crescent-shaped explosion, erupting in a cataclysm of blue light that shook the desolate landscape. When the light faded, the entity stood motionless. Yuri let out a ragged breath, his sword now glowing with a steady, controlled energy. The trial had been dangerous, but through the relentless sparring, he had finally learned how to use the mana method and wield his sword with true purpose. He noticed a change in his opponent. The entity's sword began to crack and crumble into dust, its form breaking apart. As its body dissolved into shimmering particles, it gave him a final, parting wave. Yuri understood that his time was up. With a faint smile, he offered a sincere thank you to his ancestor's spirit for the lesson. His consciousness returned to the dark cavern. He blinked his eyes open, taking a moment to reorient himself. He saw Hernando helping a dazed Jared, realizing the trial was over for them as well. The Death Knight's voice echoed in the chamber, noting that they had all had a good dream. He explained that the trial was a plan left by Eric Bryall himself, a test for any heir who found this place. Yuri grimly recalled that in his past life, the Empire had destroyed Sword Mountain, meaning no one had ever reached this place to claim the legacy. He asked the knight if the founder had used this mana method, but the knight confirmed he had not. It was Eric's final legacy, a technique he developed late in life after traveling the East, and Yuri was the first to inherit it. Yuri then questioned why it was hidden away. The knight explained that the dungeon only reveals itself when the time is right, and its appearance meant that the time to use this power was now. When Yuri pressed for a specific time, the knight simply told him to figure out on his own, because apparently ancient spirits don't do spoilers. He did, however, reveal the technique's name, Soul Severance. Yuri repeated the name, savoring the weight of it. At the knight's command, he knelt. The ancient guardian placed a gauntlet hand on his head, imparting the tenets of his duty. He was to never fear his enemies, to always act on his beliefs and to fulfill his duty to Brial until the very end. Yuri accepted each command, even when punctuated by a light bonk on the head. Finally, the knight leaned in close, delivering the most important lesson. Brial never abandons its honor, even in death. As the words settled in his soul, Yuri's eyes flashed red, embracing the weight of his family's oath. The next thing he knew, sunlight was streaming into his room. A maid burst in, announcing it was morning. Yuri sighed, the phantom exhaustion of the trial still clinging to him. The maid chided him for his late return the previous night. He stretched and offered a convenient lie, claiming he had been in the royal archives searching for a particular record. In his mind, he pictured the note he'd pretended to find, one that mentioned the founder having a brother, a man who vanished from history without a name. That man, he concluded, was the Death Knight and the original owner of the sword, now resting against his wall. His thoughts were interrupted when the maid informed him that the king had summoned him. She explained that after speaking with Sir Anando, His Majesty had asked for him immediately. Yuri gritted his teeth, realizing that the gossiping mage had ratted him out. He remembered Nando's cheerful declaration that he would report everything. The man was nothing if not true to his word. He arrived in the throne room and greeted his father. The king confirmed that Hernando had told him everything, leaving without permission and finding the founder's dungeon. Yuri nonchalantly replied that it just turned out that way. The king then asked about the sword. He slowly descended from his throne, mentioning that he'd heard from many people that Yuri had changed recently. He placed a hand on Yuri's head, asking what had caused this change. Yuri tensed, his hand instinctively tightening on his sword as he took a subtle step back. The king's eyes narrowed. When asked why he was retreating, Yuri calmly explained it was because his father had clenched his fist, which usually preceded a smack. The king seemed to accept this, unclenching his hand and again demanding an answer. Yuri met his father's gaze and began. He told him that he'd had a dream. The king listened intently. Yuri continued, stating that in this dream, he had committed a great crime. The king's expression hardened. He looked down at his son and asked what that crime was. With the king's question hanging in the air, Yuri met his father's gaze and revealed the sin from his dream, failing to protect Brial until the very end. He spun a tale woven from the truth of his past life, describing a great war where their people were massacred. He spoke of his own failure to turn the tide, of running without honor, and finally, of his own death. To sell the lie, he added a poignant detail, touching the new amulet at his neck. He explained that after waking, the necklace his mother had given him was gone. He concluded that he could only interpret the dream as a warning from his late mother. The king listened intently, then asked what had caused the kingdom's fall in this dream. Yuri hesitated for a moment, knowing it was too early to mention the empire and risk changing the future unpredictably. He claimed he wasn't sure, that the attacking army was unidentifiable. A flicker of something unreadable crossed the king's face. He decided it didn't matter if it was a nightmare or a ghostly warning. He was just glad to see his son doing better. Yuri quietly wondered if he was truly doing better, thinking that his actions were merely a desperate attempt to repent for his past failures. The king's tone shifted, announcing they had one more thing to discuss. He commanded Yuri to bring his sword. His father, Fiore Brial, was a living legend, a genius who had carved his name into the continent's history with his martial prowess. At this moment, Yuri knew he was facing one of the 10 strongest people on the continent, a true sword master. They entered the king's personal training hall, a place Yuri had never been before. The king remarked that he had once thought none of his sons had any talent for swordsmanship. With a newfound confidence, Yuri replied that he thought he was actually quite talented. The king let out an amused chuckle at his son's audacity. He drew his own blade, its polished steel gleaming as he leveled it at Yuri. The king then began to lecture, questioning the very definition of a swordsman's talent. Was it merely strength, speed, and reflexes, or perhaps wisdom? He posited that even possessing all of those didn't necessarily make one a good swordsman. Yuri answered with a firm no, surprising his father. The king agreed, explaining that the most crucial thing was an element that allowed a person to surpass their limits, a driving force stronger than fear or duty. As he spoke, his aura intensified, shifting into something overwhelming and dangerous. The king's presence became immense, a palpable pressure that radiated from him. Yuri felt it instinctively. The king wasn't just talking. He was about to go full anime sensei on him. His father described it as a calling, a deep-seated connection to one's path. He asked Yuri if he felt a similar pull toward his sword, something akin to fate. The king looked down at his son, his expression unreadable. Yuri stood silently, gripping his sword. He remembered his past life, where he was never fated to be a swordsman. But this life was different, and his father was asking him now what he truly thought. The king walked closer, his voice dropping to a low, intense tone. He asked if Yuri believed he was fated to wield a sword, if he could hear its calling, and if he would still be holding it when faced with death itself. Yuri struggled to answer, the pressure from his father's aura making it hard to breathe. The world around him seemed to darken, and he stumbled back in fear. The king's aura became a crushing force, filled with countless malevolent red eyes that stared into his soul. He gasped, and the throne room dissolved into a chaotic vision of fire and screams. He heard his father's voice roaring his name as the kingdom burned around him. He felt the cold steel of an enemy's blade piercing his side, then another cutting him down. He found himself in his old armor, surrounded by flames, utterly bewildered by the sudden shift. He looked around at the burning city of Brial. He heard the shouts of his men, recognizing him as the last remaining prince. They knelt before him, their last hope. In the distance, he saw the banners of the invading army. It was the Empire. He clutched his chest in horror, realizing with dawning dread that he was back in that moment, back when Brial was under siege. The king's aura plunged Yuri into a waking nightmare, a vivid replay of his kingdom's end. He stood amidst the inferno, stunned by the Hell's Cape unfolding around him. An enemy knight charged, screaming for the Prince of Brial to die, his face a mask of hate. Their swords met in a shower of sparks. Yuri gritted his teeth, the force of the blow rattling him, before he roared and pushed back with all his might. From all sides, his own knights urged him to flee, to run while they held the line. But he kept fighting, cutting down another soldier as he stumbled back. A bitter smile touched his lips as he wondered if it was all just a terrible dream. He felt a wave of despair, questioning if Brial was doomed to fall no matter what he did. His sword felt impossibly heavy, and a familiar helplessness washed over him as he realized he couldn't stop it. He was alone on the battlefield, surrounded by the ghosts of his failure. He gripped his sword tighter, but then something shifted. A voice from his trial echoed in his mind, reminding him of the oath he had sworn never to fear his enemies. The Death Knight's words urged him to act on his beliefs and carry on the duty of Brial until the very end. With a renewed scream of defiance, Yuri unleashed his mana, his blade glowing with an ethereal blue light as he cleaved through his phantom foes. Blood splattered across his cheek, but his eyes were clear and focused. He parried another strike, grunting from the impact, his movements fluid and deadly. A quick thrust found its mark, and his enemy fell with a choked gasp. Yuri stood over the body, his own form burning with righteous fury, breathing heavily from the exertion. Even as an enemy commander declared him a dead man walking and demanded his surrender, Yuri stood tall. He declared that the people of Brial do not discard their honor, even in death. He vowed to carry on his duty, fighting until the very end. The vision shattered. Yuri stood in the quiet training hall, his eyes still glowing red as he whispered the last words of his vow. A hand gripped his shoulder, and his father's voice called his name, asking if he could hear him. Yuri blinked, the red fading from his eyes as he looked up in shock. He saw the king and frantically looked around, shouting about the Black Army. The king told him to calm down, explaining that it had only been an illusion. Yuri stared at his trembling hands, his grip on the sword still white-knuckled as he processed what had happened. He and his father stood in silence for a moment. The king sighed, admitting that he had been wrong about his son. He looked at Yuri with a new understanding, stating that he would indeed wield the sword. Yuri closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to calm his racing heart, before opening them and nodding with firm resolve. The king's expression turned somber, making Yuri wonder why he suddenly looked like he was about to deliver a eulogy. Breaking the tension, Yuri patted his father's arm with a grin, telling him not to worry so much. He puffed out his chest and declared himself a genius. After all, a small smile cracked the king's stern facade. Then, without warning, the king's hand chopped down on Yuri's head. With a pained yelp, the prince was yeeted clean out of the training hall, sending a few birds scattering into the sky. He landed near a training dummy just as Bernard turned around, drawn by the commotion. The instructor surveyed the lump on Yuri's head and dryly asked whose masterpiece it was. Yuri mumbled that it was his father's work. Bernard noted that while the king had been rougher than usual, it wouldn't excuse him from training. Yuri confirmed he knew, a new thought occurring to him. He asked Bernard to confirm that he'd only stayed in Briolle because of a promised duel with the king. Yuri then asked if Bernard would still stay even if that duel never happened. Bernard gave him a sly look and bluntly replied, "Nope, the heartless bastard." Bernard smirked, acknowledging that the prince clearly wanted him to remain. He then issued a challenge, saying he would stay if Yuri could show him something truly convincing, like the swordsmanship of his ancestor, Eric Briolle. Yuri stood firm as Bernard questioned if he wanted to learn the founder's sword technique. With a confident nod, Yuri confirmed that it had indeed piqued his interest. He then apologized, explaining that he couldn't actually teach it. Bernard noted that it was fine if Yuri hadn't mastered it yet, as he had already considered that possibility. Yuri clarified that his lack of mastery wasn't the issue. The problem was that it wouldn't help Bernard. He ignited his sword with the blue energy of soul severance, explaining that the sword technique and the mana method were one and the same. Bernard was intrigued, noting that mana methods usually only reinforce techniques, not fused with them. Yuri closed his eyes for a moment. He explained that teaching only the sword movements would be like giving Bernard half of a whole. The instructor stroked his chin, considering this new information. After a moment, Bernard decided that was acceptable. He declared he would stay in Briolle if Yuri taught him the technique, even if it was incomplete. Bernard was confident he could still learn something from it. A sly grin spread across Yuri's face. He agreed to the deal, confirming that Bernard would stay. As Bernard took a step back, he drew his sword and asked for a demonstration. Yuri eagerly prepared himself, announcing his soul severance technique. Then he paused, adding that there was one thing he forgot to mention. With a deadpan expression, he admitted he was always going to stay in Briolle anyway. A small thought bubble revealed Bernard's true situation. The king wanted him to work for at least 10 more years. Flabbergasted, Bernard asked why Yuri wasn't attacking. Realizing he'd been had, Bernard decided to go first. Yuri gritted his teeth in annoyance, wondering why his instructor was just now telling him this as their blades clashed with a flash of light. Later that evening, the sun set over the palace. Yuri lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, realizing that the future was truly changing. He was creating a new path, one where Briolle didn't fall. The fact that Bernard, a powerful swordsman, was now staying was the first real proof of that. He felt the weight of responsibility lift slightly, replaced by a growing sense of hope. He wasn't ready to face the Empire yet, but he clenched his fist, vowing that he would stop them, no matter what. He muttered, startled by a voice. His maid, Aina, stood by his bed, pleading with him not to get into any trouble this time. Confused, Yuri sat up, asking if he had something planned. She put her hands on her hips, chiding him for getting into so much trouble that he couldn't even keep track. She was talking about the Senate meeting the next day. The king had ordered him to attend, a fact Yuri seemed to have forgotten. He ran a hand through his hair, cursing his luck. Aina informed him that most of the senators would be there. She took his hands in hers, her eyes wide with worry. She begged him not to punch any of the scary, stubborn old men. Yuri chuckled, patting her hand reassuringly and promising he didn't act like that anymore. She made him promise, and he laughed, assuring her he was sure. The next morning, The Senate meeting was already in session. A noble slammed his fist on the table, shouting his dissent. As Yuri had expected, Duke Jetari was the first to disagree. The Duke, a portly man named Gernard, argued that it was improper for the prince to learn an unapproved mana method, and many of the other nobles seemed to agree with him. They grumbled amongst themselves, turning a discussion about kingdom management into a challenge against the king's authority. The Duke suggested Yuri should learn the standard Briol method instead. One of Yuri's few supporters argued back, questioning how a technique from the founding king could be unapproved. The Duke smoothly countered, asking how they could be certain it was truly his, infuriating the prince's supporter. With a placating smile, Gernard claimed they were simply worried about the prince's well-being. Yuri gave a sarcastic smile, remarking that he was touched the Duke would hold a whole meeting just for him. Internally, he seethed, remembering this man as a traitor whose words meant nothing. The Duke then turned to the captain of the royal guard, Sain, and asked for his opinion. The captain chose his words carefully, stating that he couldn't make a conclusion yet. He explained that every mana method has pros and cons that affect individuals differently. The Duke immediately seized on the uncertainty, proclaiming the method too risky and that it should be disregarded entirely. Another lord tried to argue that this wasn't what the captain meant, but he was shouted down by one of the Duke's cronies. The other nobles nodded in agreement. Yuri watched the proceedings with a grim expression, realizing this wasn't good. The Duke had gained the upper hand. While it was possible for him to switch mana methods now, his intense training had already rooted soul severance deep within his core. He couldn't explain that, however, and struggled to find the right words. Just then, a calm voice cut through the noise, remarking that the Duke's words seemed convincing enough. Everyone turned in surprise, looking at the speaker. A man in a simple red jacket raised his hand. Baron Calcio Irantia leaned forward with a lazy smirk and asked the assembled nobles a simple question. How many of them had ever fought an orc before? Baron Irantia's question hung in the air, met with confused silence from the assembled nobles. The other lords exchanged bewildered glances. Duke Jetari, looking down his nose, demanded to know who this upstart was and what title he held. The Baron stood calmly, introducing himself as Calcio Irantia, a free baron. The Duke scoffed at the idea of a mere baron attending the Senate meeting. Calcio replied that he hadn't wanted to come either, but that he was here at the request of Count Sitter. The name gave Yuri pause. He knew of Count Sitter, the reclusive frontier lord who lived his life on the battlefield, a true soldier through and through. He was famous for never attending noble events, so sending a representative now was highly unusual. One of the other lords questioned why the Count would suddenly send someone. Calcio explained that seeing the high-ranking nobles playing politics made him understand his lord's reasoning. On the battlefield, he stated the specific mana method didn't matter. It was the user who made the difference. He then turned to Yuri, asking for his thoughts. Yuri seized the moment. He declared that as a prince of Briol, he saw no controversy in learning his ancestors' method and would do so regardless of their objections. Calcio backed him up immediately, asking why irrelevant people were making such a fuss about the prince's decision. He added that such talk usually came from those who had never drawn a sword in their lives. The Duke bristled, calling the Baron's words reckless. Calcio offered a lazy, unapologetic apology, blaming his lack of etiquette on fighting orcs every day. He repeated his question, asking how many of them had actually fought orcs. He wondered aloud if they thought monsters cared about their fancy mana methods. When one noble tried to argue that the prince was too young to make such decisions, Yuri cut him off, asking if they intended to abandon the method entirely. He then pointed out the sheer impossibility of such an act. Calcio added that since the prince clearly had no intention of giving in, he wondered if they planned to forcibly extract his mana core. The nobles sputtered that this was not what they meant at all. Calcio then turned to Yuri, noting how everyone was just stressing him out. He remarked that the royal capital must have far too much free time. One of the Duke's cronies exploded, calling the statement rude and pointing out that the frontier had been quiet lately, despite its funding. Calcio's demeanor turned chillingly dark, his eyes glowing with a faint red light. He recounted how 4 men died the day he left, and that he had personally covered the corpse of a friend he'd shared breakfast with that very morning. Orcs, he reminded the stunned nobles, never rest. The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. The mention of orcs sparked a memory for Yuri. He recalled a border issue with the Klein Duchy, where orcs had previously taken advantage of the conflict to cause massive damage. He asked Calcio if the orcs' movements had changed. The Baron confirmed they were more ominous than usual. Yuri pressed further, asking about Klein, reminding Calcio that their army was also stationed at that border. The Baron admitted that Klein's forces had suddenly retreated. The border towns, he added, were completely devastated. Yuri's mind raced as the pieces clicked into place. He casually mused aloud that the Duke's third son must have caused trouble again. The nervous twitch from the Duke and his subordinate told Yuri everything he needed to know. He had them. Clearing his throat, Yuri rose and declared the meeting over. The Duke started to protest, but Yuri continued, stating that rather than wasting time on his mana method, they should be discussing the real threats of Klein and the orcs. With a final, dismissive glance at the fuming Duke, he told them to stop fussing over a teenager and left. That night, Count Sitter's weathered face appeared in a crystal ball, asking Calcio for his assessment of the third prince. Calcio sat in his room, reporting on the rumors of the prince's change. He recalled Yuri's sharp question about Klein's army, and a slow smile spread across his face. He told his lord that the boy had a good look in his eyes. The count agreed, deciding the prince was worth investigating and ordering Calcio to look into him. Calcio acknowledged there wasn't much information yet, but agreed to dig deeper if necessary. He promised to contact the count again and ended the transmission. Looking out his window at the peaceful capital, Calcio sighed. He then spotted a hooded figure below who bore a striking resemblance to the third prince, but he dismissed it as impossible. It was, of course, Yuri, sneaking through the moonlit streets with Hernando. The mage was buzzing with excitement, comparing it to his own rebellious youth. Yuri sighed, clarifying that it wasn't a big deal since Hernando could leave the palace whenever he wanted. Hernando insisted that sneaking out with the prince felt different, more thrilling, and sounded slightly disappointed when Yuri said they weren't planning anything bad. Getting to the point, Hernando asked where they were headed. Yuri flashed a gold coin and a wicked grin, revealing their destination, the biggest illegal casino in the capital. Hernando was floored, sputtering that Yuri had just promised they weren't doing anything bad. Yuri waved off his concern, simply telling Hernando to lead the way, as he knew from experience where the mage ended up when he was blackout drunk. He then stopped, his expression turning serious. He made one thing clear. All of this was for Brial. Hernando's eyes widened, a new respect dawning on his face. This wasn't a prank. This was a plan. Fired up, Hernando threw his arm around the prince, declaring that tonight they would shake that casino to its core. As he walked, Yuri's mind conjured a gallery of faces from his past life. A few key people who had caused a great commotion in Briol. There was the big-shot moneylender, the undisputed leader of the underworld. Then there was the business titan, a woman who built the continent's most successful merchant guild from nothing. And finally, there was the legendary assassin, the one who beheaded the underworld's leader to seize his position, instilling a new level of fear throughout the streets of Briol. His eyes sharpened as he focused on the present. The one who would be killed by that assassin was the very man standing before them now, the current top loan shark, Goryo, who greeted them with a sickeningly sweet smile. Yuri crossed his arms, asking if Goryo knew who he was. Of course, the man purred, explaining that with the royal mage and the third prince visiting, the least he could do was show his face. Yuri cut him short, stating he wasn't there for a casual night of gambling. Goryo's eyes gleamed with interest, and he gestured them toward a private room to talk. Once seated, Hernando began to whisper, but Yuri quickly silenced him. Goryo surmised they hadn't come to gamble and guessed they were there to borrow money. Yuri confirmed it, explaining his intent to invest the borrowed funds. The loan shark's gaze sharpened, noting that asking him for seed capital instead of a bank meant Yuri was aiming for something much greater. Yuri shut down the probing questions, reminding the man that interrogation wasn't his job. Goryo offered a thin apology for his rudeness. Yuri accepted it, then laid out his plan. With the money he borrowed, he would purchase Mugranja, a specialty spice from the Klein region, predicting the demand would soon far outstrip the supply. Hernando looked at the prince in shock. Goryo stroked his mustache, acknowledging Mugranja as an ingredient in luxury fragrances, but expressing his doubts about its investment potential. Yuri simply reiterated that, as he said, it would be valuable soon. Hernando, piecing things together, mentioned the civil unrest in Klein and the wandering orcs, but doubted that alone would cause a price spike. He wondered if Yuri was just making a simple gamble. But Goryo saw the unwavering confidence on the prince's face. He realized this was not the foolish boy of rumors. This prince knew more than he was letting on. Changing his tune, he agreed to the deal, asking how much Yuri needed as an investor. The deal was finalized in a lavish, candlelit room upstairs from the casino floor. Goryo slid a promissory note across the table, asking for the prince's signature. A sly smile touched Yuri's lips as he signed. Later, walking through the darkened streets, Yuri examined the note. Hernando couldn't believe he had actually borrowed such a large sum for Goryo. He suddenly whined that it was unfair. He griped that Yuri hadn't given him a heads up and never even intended to gamble. Yuri shot back that if he had, Hernando, being the good little tattletale he was, would have dragged him straight to his father, a point the mage couldn't deny. Hernando changed the subject, asking if they were now heading to the Merchant Guild. Yuri confirmed he had a request to make of them. In truth, Mugranja was already a guaranteed moneymaker. The only alchemist who knew how to produce it was a close aide to Duke Klein. And Yuri knew from his past life that the alchemist would be the first to die in the impending civil war. The spice would become priceless. They walked until the streetlights faded, and Yuri stopped before a run-down, boarded-up building, knowing he couldn't entrust this task to just anyone. He announced that this was the place. Hernando stared in disbelief at the decrepit spot. Ignoring him, Yuri knocked firmly on the door, calling out for Elaine Wood. A woman's voice from within asked who they were. The door opened, and an elegant woman with weary eyes stepped out, confirming she was Elaine Wood. Yuri introduced himself as the third prince of Briol and, taking her hand, stated he wanted to entrust her with a task. Hernando grabbed Yuri's shoulder, convinced the prince had lost his mind. He hissed that anyone would say the same, questioning how he could possibly buy Mugranja through a failing business like this. Yuri smirked. She may be a struggling merchant now, but he knew it wouldn't be long before Elaine was known across the continent as the head of a legendary merchant guild. Unlike Goryo, who hid his vile deeds behind a mask of trust, Elaine treated her promises as sacred. She was a legend in his past life, but in this one, he would make her a myth, a thought that brought a dark, unsettling laugh to his lips. Hernando sighed, massaging his temples and asking if they were finally done. Yuri held up a single finger, telling him there was one more thing left. He turned and walked away, leaving Hernando to scramble after him, crying out and asking where he was going now. Having secured the loan shark and the merchant tycoon, Yuri needed to convince just one more person. He led the way into the city's grim slums, a place of desperate beggars and violent struggles over scraps. He scanned the alleyways, knowing his final target should be somewhere nearby. Then he saw them. He'd found him. He approached a small group of children huddled around a puddle. He pulled back his hood and introduced himself as Yuri, the third prince of Briol. A girl with messy, dark blue hair looked up, her eyes questioning if he was truly a prince. Yuri confirmed it, his mind flashing back to a bloody future where this same girl had cruelly killed Goryo. She was a surviving member of the Assassin's Order, a girl named Asana. Asana regarded him with suspicion, wondering what a prince was doing in the slums. Yuri told her not to be wary, claiming he was only there to help. She remained silent, her expression unreadable. Yuri turned to Hernando and demanded the money pouch. The mage reluctantly handed it over. Yuri's eyes focused on one of the other children, a sickly boy hiding behind Asana. He remembered from his past life that Asana had borrowed a huge sum from Goryo to pay for this child's treatment. Like so many others who fell into the loan shark's trap, Asana's life was ruined, leading her down the dark path of an assassin. His goal was to prevent that from ever happening. He handed the pouch to Asana, telling her to take the money and get the boy treated at the temple. Stunned, she clutched the heavy bag and asked what he wanted in return. She tensed when he said there was just one thing. He leaned in and told her to remember his name, Yuri Briol, the third prince. As they walked away, Hernando questioned why Yuri would give so much money to a beggar. Yuri simply called it an investment for the future. He had now made connections with the three people he would need most: the loan shark, the merchant, and the assassin. With them secured, there was just one person remaining. He turned to Hernando and asked what he had seen in the founder's tomb. The mage's face lit up with a mischievous grin as he answered with a single word: gambling. He recounted playing a life-or-death game at a grand casino in the Empire. Yuri deadpanned that it was fitting. Changing the subject, Yuri asked Hernando to keep what happened that day a secret, poking him in the chest for emphasis. The next day, King Fiore summoned Hernando to the throne room. He addressed the mage directly, stating that he had heard Hernando went out with Yuri the previous day. He asked for a full report. Hernando, a master of half-truths and a better liar than a drunken sailor, began his tale. He told the king that Yuri had convinced him to go to the capital's largest casino. The king's interest was piqued, and he asked if Yuri had gambled. With a straight face, Hernando confirmed that he did. He spun a tale of Yuri's poor card skills, claiming the prince lost all the money he'd lent him. When the king asked what happened afterward, Hernando continued his fabricated story. He said Yuri had taken money from Goryo to some old merchant guild and then gave a large sum to an orphan. He finished with a flourish, explaining that the prince was simply interested in seeing how the common people lived. After confirming that Yuri had then returned to the palace, Hernando bowed his head and stated that was all. The king fell silent, deep in thought. He didn't seem to buy a single word of it. The king then asked if Hernando planned to attend the upcoming ball. Hernando confirmed that he would. The king noted his surprise, to which the mage simply replied that people's minds change, and it had been a while since he had danced. Meanwhile, on the training grounds, Yuri was once again getting his but handed to him by Bernard. He noticed several maids glancing their way and cheekily remarked on Bernard's popularity. He teased that many people would be waiting for the handsome instructor at the ball. Bernard gruffly stated he wasn't interested. Changing the subject back to their sparring, he admitted that Yuri was right about the sword technique having no set form. Yuri explained that one just had to move with the flow. Bernard sighed, admitting he still couldn't understand how a mana method could also be a sword technique and that he'd need to see it in a real fight to study it properly. He did, however, praise Yuri's rapid improvement and surprisingly adept mana control. Yuri felt a twinge of guilt, explaining that his proficiency came from trying to erase the traces of the Briol method he'd learned in his past life. Bernard warned him not to rush, worried that he was growing too fast for his young body, which hadn't yet finished developing. Yuri grinned, promising he would maintain a good balance. He then suggested they continue sparring, and when Bernard agreed, he tossed aside his wooden sword and drew a real one, stating he needed to grow stronger, fast. Bernard agreed without hesitation. Yuri then proposed a bet. If he could land a single successful attack, Bernard would have to attend the ball. Bernard immediately refused, pointing out that Yuri had zero credibility and would just nullify the bet if he lost. Yuri's sword flared with blue mana as he declared, "We'll see." He lunged forward, but Bernard easily parried the strike. A few days later, on the day of the ball, a grand carriage made its way through the capital. Inside, a handsome young man with white hair rested his head against the window. He was George Ivarna Granzayan, the Empire's second prince. He teased his companion, Yekaterina, for staring so eagerly out the window. The princess smiled, explaining she was just excited and that there was someone she was eager to meet. Before the royal ball, Aina fussed over Yuri's formal attire in his chambers. He examined his reflection, finding the gold epaulets and glittering decorations far too flashy for his current tastes. He instructed her to remove the excess ornamentation, much to her surprise. She reminded him that he used to love such things, but his taste had clearly changed. Once she was finished, Yuri turned to her and unexpectedly extended a hand, asking for a dance. He explained that he needed to practice and had no one else to ask. Aina looked at him with profound suspicion, questioning if this was some prank to make her fall. He assured her he was serious and gently pulled her into a starting position. A deep blush crept up her neck as she followed his lead. She was surprised to find he was a fairly good dancer and asked if he danced often. He teased that while he was quite popular, he had never danced with someone so short. She was like a fun-sized candy bar, but with more sass and a tendency to stomp on feet. As if on cue, she accidentally stepped on his foot. Their playful bickering continued with her repeated mistakes. Later, the grand ballroom was alive with music and the graceful movements of the nobility. From his ornate throne, King Fiore watched the proceedings with a glass of wine in hand. Yuri stood by the refreshment table with his brothers, his eyes scanning the crowd. He was surprised to see the reclusive frontier lord, Count Sitter, in attendance. His focus shifted as his older brother Cedric approached, and Yuri casually inquired if his brother's eyesight was worsening. A sudden horn blast cut through the hall, announcing the arrival of the imperial delegation. Prince George Ivarna Granzin strode confidently into the room, approaching the throne to exchange formal greetings with the king. The prince then gestured to his companion, and Yuri's blood ran cold. Princess Yekaterina stepped forward, offering a perfect curtsy. The sight of her sent shards of broken memories through Yuri's mind, her betrayal, her false apologies, and the ruin she brought upon him. He clenched his fist, vowing never to make the same mistake again. From across the room, Yekaterina's gaze swept over the Briol princes. The crowd murmured in admiration as Cedric began to socialize, his benevolent nature on full display. Yuri felt a pang of inadequacy watching him, but his focus remained on Yekaterina, who was now being approached by Cedric. The frustration was overwhelming. What could he possibly want with the woman who was the source of his worst memories? Sensing his distress, Aina appeared with a tray of cookies. He thanked her quietly, and she cheekily remarked that taking care of him now was nothing compared to dealing with his past self before leaving him with the snacks. As Yuri sighed in brief solitude, a pair of boots stopped before him. He looked up into the face of Prince George, the very man who had commanded the armies that destroyed Briol. Yuri introduced himself formally, his mind racing. He had to remain calm and conceal his hatred. George's gaze was sharp and assessing, and Yuri felt a strange pressure emanate from him as the imperial prince probed his mana. Yuri flinched but held his ground. George smiled, remarking that Yuri had some talent for a 13-year-old, a true son of Fiore. Yuri's hand tightened into a fist. He hadn't expected the prince to be so powerful already. He cursed both siblings internally. Just then, a cry was heard. Aina had stumbled, spilling wine and falling to her knees in a panic. George looked down at her with a dismissive smirk, his presence looming over the terrified maid. Yuri watched in horror as George's hand went to the hilt of his sword. The prince declared that the maid had committed a grave mistake, and for such disrespect, the only fitting punishment was death. In that instant, Yuri knew with burning certainty that George had tripped her on purpose. Under the ornate ballroom chandelier, a tense silence fell as Prince George loomed over the terrified Aina. He declared that the law demanded a penalty for her mistake, his cruel smile widening as he suggested a beheading would suffice. Before Yuri could react, King Fiore's voice cut through the air like a blade. He coldly informed the imperial prince that if he wished to see blood, he should do it in his own land. George paused for a moment before offering a disingenuous apology. With feigned respect, he reminded the king of their nation's mutual honor, implying Briol was failing to uphold its end. The king then brought up an old incident involving a knight named Gatintia, which George deftly turned against him. He recalled how the emperor had shown grace when King Fiore executed that imperial knight, framing his current actions as merely protecting the honor of both nations. Yuri understood the checkmate. George had trapped his father with past precedent. Briol's honor was now on the line, and to stop the prince would be a direct challenge to the empire. Yuri was caught between reason and power, the ideal and the grim reality. But then, a flash of red crossed his vision, and he remembered the oath of his ancestors. Briol does not abandon honor. That was the unbreakable vow of the Briols. With a sharp clang of steel, Yuri's sword blocked George's path just as it neared Aina's neck. He declared that since Aina was his maid, her wrongdoing was his to bear. The king watched, realizing the implication. Yuri, positioning himself as a shield, stated that as a prince himself, his station should be considered, and he formally requested that George withdraw the execution order. Instead, he proposed a trial by duel. George erupted in laughter, the sound echoing through the stunned hall. Finding the situation highly amusing, he agreed. He asked for permission to call Yuri by his first name, a subtle assertion of dominance, to which Yuri consented as the crowd murmured in shock. George then turned to the king, presenting Yuri's reasonable suggestion and boxing Fiore into a corner. With a heavy sigh, the king gave his reluctant approval. George announced that for the sake of dignity, he would use a proxy. With condescending generosity, he declared he would pick the youngest guard to match Yuri's age before taking his leave. The immediate crisis over, Yuri turned to the trembling Aina. He helped her to her feet and gently told her to go rest. She protested, but he insisted she not worry about him and watched as she was led away by the other maids. He walked away from the main hall, his path taking him past Yekaterina, whose cold gaze followed him. He dismissed the useless thoughts she stirred within him and continued into a quieter corridor. There, he found his brother Cedric waiting for him. Cedric demanded to know what he was thinking. Startled, Yuri simply stated that he couldn't let George kill Aina. A slow smile spread across Cedric's face. He patted Yuri's head, a rare gesture of affection that surprised the younger prince. Cedric then offered his help, explaining George's insidious trap. By picking a young opponent, any accident during the duel could be easily dismissed, putting Yuri in grave danger. Yuri understood the risk, but refused the offer, stating firmly that he started this and would finish it. With a confident smirk, he assured his brother he could handle it. Cedric, seeing his resolve, nodded and placed his trust in him, offering to manage the ball while Yuri rested. Yuri accepted, reflecting that his brother would have made a fine king. In this new life, he would fight to see that future come to pass, no matter who stood in his way. The next day, under a clear sky, the duel was set to begin in a grand courtyard. The imperial siblings watched from their seats, while Briol's nobles, including Captain Saint and a smirking Hernando, looked on. The chosen imperial guard was young, but radiated stable energy, his swordsmanship clearly adept. Saint worried for the prince's safety, but Hernando simply told him to watch. Across the arena, Yuri stretched with a loud yawn, looking about as threatened as a cat in a sunbeam. He assured the worried onlookers that they had no need to worry. The rank of Grand Wizard was a legend, an unobtainable title. It was reserved only for those mages of the Magic Tower who had mastered an origin magic. Among these, the ultimate power was fate-revealing magic, which allowed a glimpse into the world's destiny. In the entire world, only Hernando had ever reached that level. He recalled the first time he met Prince Yuri, acting all high and mighty at a card table. It was the first time Hernando had ever lost money since obtaining his power. It couldn't have been a simple coincidence. He could read any opponent's fortune, but he couldn't read a single thing about that brat. Instead, he saw a vision of a sword mountain, where a bloodied boy fought relentlessly before collapsing in despair. Perhaps his obsession started then. A story he once dismissed as a fluke began to revolve around that single point. After their recent outing, Hernando became convinced that his magic was not wrong. Prince Yuri was simply a person with no destiny. That was why, as he watched the duel begin, he told a worried Captain Sane that there was no need for concern. The Imperial Guard taunted Yuri for his lengthy warm-up. Prince George smugly asked if Yuri needed more time to prepare. Both combatants declared they were ready at any time. With a grim expression, King Fiore officially started the trial by combat. The two fighters took their stances in the arena. Yuri immediately rushed forward to commence the fight. Their swords met with a sharp clang, the Imperial Guard shocked by the force of the parry. His hands tightened on his hilt as they engaged in a blur of furious strikes. The clash of steel echoed through the courtyard, but Yuri remained unfazed as his opponent prepared another attack. The king turned to Hernando, who respectfully acknowledged him. His Majesty asked what the mage thought the outcome would be. Hernando's golden eyes were unreadable as he pictured the vision of Yuri's bloody, desperate battle. With a slight smile, he confessed that he did not know. The king pressed, reminding him of his claims of being guided by the heavens. He asked if it was time for the mage to leave. Hernando replied that he was not, humbly noting how much honor the king already showed him. The king warned him that excessive modesty could bring misfortune. Hernando then asked who his Majesty believed was stronger. The Imperial Guard pressed his attack with red-hot fury. The king stated his belief that the opponent was stronger. Hernando simply acknowledged that it certainly seemed that way. He explained that he came to Brioel following heavenly signs which foretold that the continent's strongest person was here. But since the king's sword remained undrawn, he thought his reason for staying was gone. He was about to leave this boring kingdom, which had all the excitement of watching paint dry. A sharp ring of steel drew his attention back to the fight. Yuri was pushed back, but he was unbroken. A smirk played on his lips. It seemed it wasn't quite time to lose yet. He had finished testing the waters and decided it was time to end this. He suddenly exploded with speed, closing the distance in a blue flash. The attack was a blur of motion, too fast for the guard to comprehend. The guard realized with stark terror that he was about to die. The imperial siblings gasped in shock. The king leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. The Brioel knight stared, dumbfounded. Even Hernando was amazed, unable to believe Yuri had twisted his sword at the last moment. Yuri stood over his opponent, his blade at the guard's throat, while the guard's own broken sword was pressed against him. The guard stammered in disbelief and finally declared his loss. As the crowd erupted, Hernando marveled at the outcome. At the tip of the prince's sword, a fate of death had been turned into life. Yuri was defying the heavens, someone outside the fate of this world. He was Yuri Brioel, the one who transcends destiny. Clapping with genuine delight, Hernando thought that he couldn't wait to see how the prince would continue to change the world's destiny from here on out. Hernando was ecstatic. He had followed fate to Brioel only to meet someone who actively defied it. Prince George watched as the cycle of life and death played out. But at the tip of Yuri's sword, a new story was written. The Brioel knights roared with approval at the sight of Yuri wiping a smudge from his cheek, victorious. Hernando was thrilled with anticipation, eager to see how this transcender of fate would reshape the world. 5 years passed under a bright, sunny sky. In a palace corridor, a new maid hurried along, panicking that she had mixed up her assigned area. If she were caught, she would be in deep trouble. A sharp voice called out, freezing her in her tracks. She looked up to see a tall, imposing young man with the black hair of Brioel royalty. He demanded to know what she was doing there. The maid quickly tried to recall the how to identify the royals for dummies guide her seniors had drilled into her. The king had a boring expression, and the crown prince had a gentle smile. This man was neither. With his sinister eyes and arrogant posture, he grew angry at her silence. She deduced he had to be the third prince and tried to make a hasty exit. Yuri stepped into her path, asking if the staff had some secret manual on how to avoid him. He was about to educate her on proper etiquette when another voice called out to his brother, asking what trouble he was causing this time. The maid remembered the final instruction. A confident man carrying a sword was the third prince. Later, Yuri enjoyed a cookie in the garden, a peace offering from the new maid he'd educated. He had to admit, it was quite delicious. He flexed his hands, feeling a new mastery. He had reached the unarmed realm, a state where mana integration lessened the pressure of holding a sword. It seemed his training had paid off. It had been 5 years since he regressed, since he woke up in his bed after being killed. He knew his peaceful days were numbered. The sound of arguing from the conference room proved his point. He knocked, but no one heard him. The guard suggested he try again, but Yuri, fed up, simply gathered mana into his fist and punched the door clean off its hinges. The nobles stared in shock. Yuri gave a casual apology, explaining that since no one heard his first knock, he simply used more force the second time. He addressed his father and calmly asked to join the conference. The king nodded for the meeting to continue. One noble argued they had no spare troops for the empire's request, while another lord called the remark irresponsible. They were all just bickering about their own gains and losses. Yuri recognized the scenario from his past. It was the empire's call to join the allied forces, a massive orc raid that was doomed to fail. The enraged orcs then rampaged across the participating nations' borders, all except for the empire's. It was a setup from the very beginning, one that cost the life of the great knight Lien Flandra. Yuri would not let that happen again. He slammed his hand on the table, silencing the argument. He declared that he would go. He announced his intent to join the allied forces and challenged the nobles to show their own sincerity. It was time for them to do their duty, so the name of Brial would not be brought to shame. He smirked, and the king watched him, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Later, during his training session, his brother Cedric ran up to him, out of breath. Cedric frantically asked if he was truly going to the front lines, insisting that royalty had no need to go. Yuri simply stated that it was the duty of a royal. Cedric was stunned, then burst into laughter, finally understanding his brother's mindset. He made a grand, dramatic promise to protect the palace in Yuri's absence before dashing off. Yuri dryly commented on the touching brotherly bond. He asked Bernard if he wasn't worried about him. The instructor replied that as long as Yuri wasn't reckless, he believed he would return in one piece, but still urged him to be careful. He warned that the orcs were more despicable than he could imagine, especially the flag-bearing orcvils. Yuri assured him he had his ways. Just as Bernard asked about his plan, Aina came running from the palace, announcing that a guest had arrived with something he ordered. Yuri turned back to his instructor with a confident smile, confirming that he had a very special plan indeed. Aina hurried to announce a guest. In the training grounds, Bernard questioned Yuri's plan, but the prince just smirked, confirming he had a very special one indeed. Later, in an opulent reception room, Yuri entered to meet his guest. Guillermo, the vice president of the Elaine Merchant Guild, greeted him formally. Yuri asked after Elaine, and Guillermo explained she was on the road, so he had come in her stead. Yuri mused that she was still handling business trips herself, a testament to her dedication. The merchant then presented a small, ornate box, the item Yuri had requested. Yuri opened it with a satisfied smile. Inside lay the Elementarian, a set of 4 beautifully crafted daggers. Guillermo questioned their value, but Yuri assured him they were priceless artifacts imbued with ancient magic. To prove his point, he made one of the daggers float, which sent Guillermo into a comically panicked frenzy. Yuri calmly reassured the merchant he wouldn't die. Guillermo, amazed by the prince's mana control, realized Yuri wasn't just fooling around every day. Yuri just smirked, thinking, "Did you really think my glow-up was just for show?" Suddenly, Yuri's focus sharpened, but he quickly dismissed it. He sent his regards to Elaine and tasked Guillermo with reporting on their new empire branch before dismissing him. Once the merchant was gone, Yuri leaned back on the sofa, calling for his hidden guest to emerge from the shadows. Asana appeared silently beside him. He asked her about the lone shark, Goriel. Asana confirmed she had delivered his warning as ordered, leaving a bloody message on his pillow while he slept. She then asked if the rumors were true, if he was really joining the Union Army. He confirmed it, and she urged him to be careful. He countered that she was coming with him, which surprised her. He asked if she could keep up, and her confident smile was all the answer he needed. He told her he would be in touch, and she vanished back into the shadows. A few days later, on the day of his departure, Cedric hurried over to him. He wished his brother to take care. Yuri confidently boasted that he was invincible and would raise the image of the Bryals. Cedric playfully reminded him to take care of his eyes, smiling warmly as he pulled his younger brother into a tight embrace. Yuri promised he would be back. The horns blew to begin the ceremony. King Fiori stood before the assembled troops, ready to proceed. Yuri ascended the steps, his armor gleaming. His father asked if he was nervous, but Yuri replied he wasn't at all. The king then told him to look behind him. An army of soldiers stood at attention, a sea of valuable lives that now rested on his shoulders. He knew not all of them would return, but he vowed their deaths would not be as pitiful as those in his past life. The king asked if he was sure he could do it. As Yuri began to answer, his father unleashed an overwhelming wave of murderous intent. It was an absolute pressure that felt like death itself. His body froze. Instinct told him this was an inescapable end, but he knew he could reject it. A surge of blue mana erupted from him, forming a protective barrier. He met his father's pressure with his own, their invisible forces clashing with the sound of grinding steel. The king smiled, satisfied. "Well done," he said. He explained that his test was to replace a formal letter of departure and simply told his son to come back alive. Yuri gave a slight nod, then raised his sword to the sky. He addressed the army, declaring himself Yuri Bryal, third prince of the kingdom. He commanded them to put their trust in him. With a final order to march, he led the soldiers out, their unified cry shaking the very foundations of the capital. Meanwhile, in a dark, torch-lit dungeon, a massive hand gripped the iron bars of a cell. A monstrous, red-eyed creature stared out from the darkness. A scarred, armored man looked back at the prisoner, remarking that they were meeting again after 5 long years.